Hook 0 to 15s. Your company has no idea what you're worth, not a rough idea, not a ballpark, no idea. And the terrifying part? They never did. Tension 15 to 60s. Think about the last time you asked for a raise. You probably prepared. You researched market rates. You listed your accomplishments. You rehearsed what you were going to say in the mirror at 6 a.m. like you were prepping for a courtroom. And then your manager sat across from you and said something like, "I'll have to check with HR," or "the budget is tight this cycle," or the classic, "You're already at the top of your band." What they didn't say, what they couldn't say, was the actual reason. Because the actual reason is this: nobody in that building, not your manager, not HR, not the CFO, can explain with any real logic why you earn exactly what you earn. Pay transparency laws were supposed to fix this. They were supposed to pull back the curtain, and they did, just not in the way anyone expected. Body. Here's what happened when companies started posting salary ranges. Workers saw the numbers, and the numbers were confusing. A posted range of $60,000 to $140,000 for the same job title, same role, same responsibilities. $80,000 of ambiguity sitting right there in a job listing. And when current employees started asking, "Wait, where am I in that range and why?" managers went quiet. Not because they were hiding something devious, but because they genuinely didn't know. Here's what nobody tells you about how salary actually works inside most companies. When you were hired, someone made a judgment call, based on what you asked for, based on how much the previous person in that role made, based on how desperate the hiring manager was that quarter, based on vibes, frankly. And then, that number got locked in. It compounded. You got your 3% annual raise, and 5 years later, you're making exactly what the market was paying in 2021. This isn't a conspiracy. It's something almost worse. It's institutional inertia disguised as a system. There's a concept in organizational psychology called pay compression. It's what happens when new hires coming in the door are offered market-rate salaries, while long-tenured employees are still anchored to whatever number they negotiated years ago. The result? In a lot of companies, the person who's been there 8 years is making less than the person who started 8 months ago. And when pay transparency makes that visible, something breaks. Not just morale, something deeper. Because here's the question this raises that nobody in the corporate world wants to answer. If the company can't explain the pay gap between two people doing the same job, what does that say about how they see those people? Let that sit for a second. A 2025 study from the Institute for Women's Policy Research found that in companies newly subject to pay transparency requirements, more than 60% of managers reported they felt unprepared to have compensation conversations with their teams. 60%. These are people whose literal job includes managing humans, and they had no framework for explaining compensation, because the framework doesn't exist. Most companies don't have a compensation philosophy, they have a compensation history. A series of decisions made under deadline pressure by people who are no longer there, calcified into a spreadsheet that HR guards like it contains state secrets. And when that spreadsheet gets exposed, even partially, the reaction inside companies is almost always the same pattern. First, leadership sends an email about our commitment to pay equity. Then HR schedules listening sessions. Then, very quietly, nothing changes. But something has changed. The employee has changed. There's a psychological term for what happens next: cognitive dissonance resolution. When people discover that a belief they held, in this case the belief that their pay reflected their value, turns out to be false, they don't just update the belief and move on. They recalibrate their entire relationship to the thing that caused the dissonance. In plain English, they stop caring. Not loudly, not dramatically. They just disengage. They do the job, They stop going the extra mile. They start looking. And the company, which created this situation through years of opaque, arbitrary pay decisions, wonders why retention is suddenly a problem. Here's the deeper pattern nobody is talking about. Pay opacity wasn't just an administrative failure, it was a power structure. As long as you didn't know what your colleagues made, the company held an information advantage over you in every compensation conversation. You were negotiating blind. They weren't. Pay transparency doesn't just expose pay gaps, it destroys that information asymmetry. And companies built on that asymmetry are now scrambling. Some are responding by making salary ranges so wide they're meaningless. Others are reclassifying roles to create artificial distinctions that justify different pay. Some are doubling down on vague performance metrics that let managers justify almost any number. The system is adapting. It always does. But here's what the system cannot adapt away from: the feeling. The feeling of finding out that the number on your paycheck was never really about you. It was about budget cycles and negotiation leverage, and whoever happened to be in the room when an offer got made. That feeling doesn't go away when HR sends another email. Climax. Here's the central thing. For decades, compensation was sold to us as a meritocracy. Work hard, demonstrate value, get paid accordingly. We built our entire sense of professional self-worth around that premise. Pay transparency didn't create a new problem. It revealed that the meritocracy was always largely a story, a useful story, a story that kept people motivated and compliant and slightly too afraid to ask questions. And now that the story is cracking open, people aren't just angry about the money. They're grieving something. They're grieving the version of their career where the system was basically fair, where their salary meant something about their contribution, where the invisible hand was actually tracking their effort. It wasn't. It isn't. The salary you're paid right now is far more a product of when you were hired, how well you negotiated under pressure during an interview, and what arbitrary band some HR consultant designed 5 years ago than it is a reflection of what you actually produce. Knowing that changes things. It should. Ending. The interesting question isn't, what do I do about this? The interesting question is, what does it mean that we built our sense of professional identity on a system this arbitrary? Because the discomfort most people feel when they find out a colleague earns more for the same work isn't really about the money. It's the sudden vertigo of realizing the scoreboard you've been playing against your whole career was never properly calibrated. Pay transparency is the mirror. The reflection is uncomfortable. But the people who look anyway, who stop negotiating against a fictional version of their own worth and start asking harder questions, those are the people who eventually build something real. The system didn't know what you were worth. Maybe it's time you decided for yourself.